Grandma Beatrice's house always smelled like old books and cinnamon. Not a bad smell, just a quiet one. It was the kind of smell that made you want to walk on your tiptoes and whisper, even if no one else was home. Her house was full of quiet things. The grandfather clock in the hall didn't tick-tock like normal clocks. It made a soft, heavy thump, 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 like a slow heartbeat. The carpets were so thick that your feet disappeared a little with every step. Everything was tidy. Perfectly tidy. The cushions on the sofa had little karate chops in the middle of them, and the magazines on the coffee table were fanned out in a perfect star shape. It wasn't like my house, which smelled like toast and dog, and sometimes my dad's smelly sneakers. Our house was noisy and messy and full of things that were allowed to be broken. But there was one thing in Grandma Beatrice's house that wasn't quiet. It was a music box, and it was my favorite thing in the whole world. It was made of a dark, shiny wood, and when you opened the lid, a tiny ballerina with a painted-on smile would twirl to a song that sounded like falling stars. Grandma said it was her mother's, my great-grandmother, which made it feel like holding a secret. She let me play with it, but only when she was in the room, and only after I washed my hands. "Be careful, Lily," she would say every single time, her voice as neat as the rest of her house. "It's very delicate." I was always careful. I would sit on the thick carpet, open the lid as gently as I could, and watch the ballerina spin and spin until the music slowed down and finally stopped. I'd imagine she was a real princess, dancing in a castle made of glass, and I was the only one who could see her. That afternoon, the sun was making dusty stripes in the air. Grandma Beatrice was in the kitchen, and I could hear the gentle clink of a spoon against a teacup. I had the music box open in front of me. The ballerina was dancing her silent, perfect dance. I wanted to touch her just for a second. I wanted to see if her tiny pink dress felt as smooth as it looked. My fingers were clumsy that afternoon. Maybe from the cookie crumbs, maybe just because I was 8. I reached out and my fingertip just barely brushed her plastic skirt. But it was enough. The tiny dancer wobbled. My hand jerked back, and in that same clumsy movement, I knocked the whole box. It slipped from my lap. It didn't make a loud crash. Just a sad little thud on the wooden floor. The music stopped mid-note. I held my breath. For a second, everything was still. Then, slowly, I picked it up. The lid had fallen shut. I opened it again. The ballerina was lying on her side. Her delicate plastic leg had snapped at the ankle. She was broken. Her smile was still there, but it looked wrong now, like a joke no one was laughing at. The music wouldn't play. I tried winding the key, but it just made a sick, grinding noise. A big, hot feeling swelled up in my chest, and then it came out of my mouth in a sob that surprised even me. It wasn't a small cry. It was huge and wet and loud. It felt like the world was ending, right there on Grandma Beatrice's polished floor. The ballerina would never dance again, and it was all my fault. The secret I was holding was broken. Tears streamed down my face, dripping from my chin onto my t-shirt. I couldn't stop them. It felt like the sadness was 100 times bigger than me. The sound of her sensible shoes clicking on the floorboards stopped right behind me. I looked up, my face wet and blotchy, hoping for a hug, hoping for her to say it was okay, that we could fix it. But Grandma Beatrice just looked down at the broken box in my hands, then at me. She wasn't angry. Her face was just tight. She sighed, a small, impatient puff of air. "Goodness," she said, her voice as crisp as a starched napkin. "Such a fuss over a little toy. No one likes a dramatic girl, Lily." Dramatic. The word echoed in my ears. It felt sharp and pointy, like a needle. I wasn't being dramatic. I was sad. Weren't they the same thing? She didn't understand. She didn't see that the ballerina wasn't just a toy. She was a secret, a story, a song. And now she was just a piece of broken plastic in a silent box. My grandmother bent down, but not to comfort me. She picked up the tiny broken leg from the carpet, holding it between her thumb and forefinger as if it were a dead insect. "We'll have to throw this out now," she said simply, and turned to walk back to the kitchen. My sobs caught in my throat, choked off by the sharp sting of her words. I scrambled to my feet, clutching the broken ballerina in my hand, and ran. I didn't go to the living room where she might see me. I ran to the little guest room at the end of the hall, the one that smelled like lavender and forgotten things. I closed the door, making sure it clicked shut, and only then, in the quiet, dusty silence, did I let myself cry again. I pressed my face into a pillow that was more for decoration than for sleeping, muffling the sound so no one would hear, so no one would call me dramatic ever again. The guest room pillow was stiff and smelled faintly of lavender potpourri. It wasn't a comforting smell. It was a formal, polite smell, the kind that sits in a bowl and is never meant to be touched. It was a perfect pillow for muffling the kind of sobs that no one wanted to hear. I cried until my throat was raw and my head felt fuzzy. The ballerina's broken body clutched tight in my fist. The sharp edge of her snapped leg pressed into my palm, a tiny grounding pain. After a while, the big heaving cries turned into small, hiccuping breaths. The storm inside me had passed, leaving behind a gray, empty quiet. I sat up and uncurled my fingers. The ballerina lay in my palm, lifeless. Her painted smile seemed to mock me. I took the tiny leg, which I had somehow remembered to grab, and tried to fit it back onto her ankle. It wouldn't stay. It just fell off again. A useless little twig of plastic. No one likes a dramatic girl. Grandma Beatrice's words weren't shouting in my head anymore. They were settling in, sinking deep into the empty space the sadness had left behind. I thought about the word, dramatic. I remembered my teacher, Mrs. Davison, using it once when I cried after scraping my knee on the playground. "Don't be so dramatic, Lily. It's just a little scratch." I remembered my own mom saying it, but in a laughing way, when I would dance around the living room, pretending to be a rock star. "You're so dramatic," she'd say, smiling. But Grandma Beatrice hadn't been smiling. Her face had been closed and disappointed. It was the same face she made when I'd accidentally spilled a drop of juice on her white tablecloth. It was a face that said, "You have made a mess." And I had. My tears were a mess. My loud, ugly sobs were a mess. My feelings were a mess. And messy things had to be cleaned up and put away. In Grandma Beatrice's house, things were not allowed to be messy. I decided, sitting there on the floor of the lavender-scented room, that I wouldn't be messy anymore. I would be quiet. I would be neat. I wouldn't be dramatic. I would be a girl people could like. I carefully placed the broken ballerina and her tiny leg into the pocket of my jeans. They were my secret now, a secret of shame. I wiped my puffy eyes with the back of my hand and stood up. I looked at myself in the big gold-framed mirror over the dresser. My face was red and splotchy. My hair was a mess. I looked dramatic. I took a deep breath, the way I saw grown-ups do when they were trying to be patient. I pushed my hair out of my face and tried to smooth my shirt. The door opened without a knock. Grandma Beatrice stood there, a dish towel in her hand. She didn't look at me, not really. Her eyes scanned the room, as if checking to make sure I hadn't broken anything else. "Your mother will be here in 20 minutes, she said. Her voice was perfectly even, as if nothing had happened, as if her granddaughter hadn't just had her heart broken on the living room floor. "Go to the bathroom and wash your face. You can't let her see you looking like that." I didn't say anything. I just nodded, my throat too tight to speak. I walked past her, trying not to brush against her dress. I felt her eyes on my back as I went down the hall. They didn't feel warm or concerned. They felt like they were inspecting me, checking for flaws. In the bathroom, the water was cold against my hot skin. I scrubbed at my face, trying to erase the evidence of my tears. I looked in the mirror again. The redness was fading a little. I looked less like a mess. I looked more quiet. When my mom arrived, I was sitting on the sofa, my hands folded neatly in my lap. Grandma Beatrice was telling my mom about her neighbor's prize-winning roses. She handed my mom a small bag of cookies she had baked. "Was she a good girl?" my mom asked, smiling and ruffling my hair. Grandma Beatrice looked at me for a fraction of a second. "She was very quiet," she said. And in her world, I knew that was the highest compliment. On the car ride home, my mom chattered about her day. I answered her questions with yes or no. I could feel the sharp edges of the broken ballerina in my pocket. It was a constant reminder. I wanted to pull the pieces out and show my mom, to tell her how the music had stopped, how the dancer's smile was a lie now. I wanted to cry again, to let her hug me and tell me it was okay to be sad. But the words were stuck. A new invisible door had been installed inside of me and it was firmly closed. Behind it, the sad, messy feelings were locked away. Because no one likes a dramatic girl. And more than anything in the world, I just wanted to be liked. That night, in my own messy, wonderful, noisy room, I took the pieces of the ballerina out of my pocket. I hid them in a small, empty jewelry box at the back of my closet, a place no one else would ever look. It was my first secret, the first piece of myself that I learned to hide, the first time I chose to be quiet instead of being real, and it would not be the last. The years that followed were quiet ones, at least on my side of the door. The closed door from the guest room had become a permanent part of my architecture. It wasn't a physical door anymore, but a heavy, soundproof one I carried inside me. On one side was the real me, a messy, noisy girl full of feelings that were too big and too bright. On the other side was the Lily the world saw, calm, sensible, and completely undramatic. I became a professional listener. In middle school and then high school, my friends' lives were filled with the kind of drama I had learned to fear. There were tearful breakups in the school cafeteria, screaming matches with parents over curfews, passionate arguments about who was betraying whom. They were storms of emotion, and I was the quiet harbor everyone sailed into. "You're so easy to talk to, Lily," my best friend Maya would say, wiping her mascara-stained tears after a fight with her boyfriend. "You never judge." I didn't judge. I didn't do much of anything. I would nod, hand her a napkin, and offer practical advice. "Well, maybe you should make a list of pros and cons," I'd suggest, or, "Have you considered talking to him when you're both calm?" I was good at solutions, at fixing things. I was like a mechanic for feelings, but I never got my own hands dirty. I never said, "That sounds so painful, I'm so sorry," because to say that would be to touch the pain, and I was terrified it might be contagious. My own life was a flat, calm sea. I got good grades. I joined the library club. I never had a detention. Teachers loved me. Such a mature young woman, they'd write on my report cards. My mom was proud, but sometimes she would look at me with a little furrow in her brow. "Is everything okay, sweetie?" she'd ask. "You're so serious sometimes." "I'm fine, Mom," I'd say, and she would let it go. How could she argue? My life was perfect, neat, tidy. There were no messes to clean up. Grandma Beatrice adored the person I had become. During our stiff, infrequent visits, she would hold me up as an example to my younger cousins, who were still prone to skinned knees and loud tantrums. "Look at Lily," she'd say, her voice full of pride. "So composed. She understands that you don't need to make a spectacle of yourself to be noticed." Every time she said it, I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. She was praising a ghost, a carefully constructed costume I wore every day. And the worst part was, some part of me believed her. I was proud of my control. I saw the messy emotions of others as a weakness, a lack of discipline. Dramatic, I would think, a silent echo of my grandmother's voice. Then, when I was 16, I met a boy named Liam. He wasn't in the library club. He was in a band that practiced too loudly in his parents' garage. He had messy hair that was always falling into his eyes, and he didn't just smile. He grinned, a big lopsided grin that made you want to grin back. He was the complete opposite of quiet. He liked me for some reason I couldn't understand. He said I was mysterious. He didn't see me as calm. He saw me as a puzzle he wanted to solve. "What are you thinking about, Lily?" he'd ask, his head tilted. "You get this look on your face like you're a million miles away." I was usually a million miles away. I was behind my door, watching him, analyzing him. I liked him. I liked the way his hand felt when it brushed against mine, the way he laughed at his own bad jokes. It was a feeling like a tiny sprout pushing its way through concrete. It was terrifying. One evening, we were sitting in his car after a movie. He had been telling me about a fight he'd had with his band's guitarist. He was passionate, waving his hands, his voice full of frustration and anger. I listened, nodding. "Just kick him out of the band," I said finally. It was the logical solution. Liam stopped and just stared at me. "What? Just like that? He's my best friend, Lily. We grew up together. But he's not being a good friend right now," I reasoned. "It's causing problems." "Life causes problems," he said, and his voice was louder than I expected. "It's supposed to be messy. You don't just throw people away because it's not perfect. Don't you ever get angry? Don't you ever just want to scream?" I froze. The air in the car suddenly felt thick and heavy. No one likes a dramatic girl. The words were a cold hand on my heart. "No," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't." The look on his face was not anger. It was confusion and a little bit of sadness. He saw the wall I had built around myself, and for the first time, someone didn't think it was mysterious or mature. He thought it was just sad. He drove me home in silence. The next day at school, he was with his friends laughing. He waved, but it was different. The puzzle was too hard to solve, and he was giving up. I told myself it was for the best. Relationships were messy. They were dramatic. But that night, I couldn't study. I couldn't read. I went to the back of my closet, reached behind a stack of old yearbooks, and pulled out the small jewelry box. It was dusty. I opened it. The broken ballerina lay inside, her plastic smile yellowed with age. The tiny, detached leg rested beside her, and as I looked at her, I wasn't a composed 16-year-old anymore. I was 8 again, on the floor of a quiet, lonely house, being told that my sadness was a performance. I had locked this broken little dancer away, and I had locked myself away with her. For the first time in 8 years, I felt the hot swell of tears behind my eyes. I wanted to cry. I wanted to scream, just like Liam had said, but I couldn't. The door was shut too tight. I just sat there on my bedroom floor, holding the evidence of my first heartbreak, feeling absolutely nothing at all, and it was the most painful feeling I had ever known. The hollow ache I felt that night, holding the broken ballerina, didn't lead to a dramatic breakdown. It did something quieter, something more insidious. It reinforced the wall. The brief, painful encounter with Liam had taught me that letting someone get close enough to see the cracks was dangerous. So I added more bricks, more mortar. I went off to college and chose a major that made sense: accounting. It was a world of numbers, of debits and credits, of things that balanced perfectly. There was no room for messy emotions in a spreadsheet. I was, by all accounts, a success. I graduated with honors and got a job at a respectable firm. My life was a model of efficiency. My apartment was minimalist and clean, a modern echo of my grandmother's house, but with less cinnamon and more stainless steel. I had work friends, the kind you share polite lunches with, but no one who ever saw the inside of my apartment or the inside of my head. My relationship with my mother settled into a comfortable, if distant, pattern. We spoke on the phone every Sunday. She'd tell me about her garden, her book club, her friends. I'd tell her about my work. The conversations were like smooth stones, skipping across the surface of a deep lake, never once breaking the tension to see what lay beneath. The question in her eyes from my teenage years was still there, a permanent, low-level hum of concern, but she learned not to ask it outright anymore. Grandma Beatrice passed away when I was 24. I went to the funeral, of course. I stood by the grave, dry-eyed, listening to the minister talk about what a wonderful, dignified woman she had been. My cousins were crying, their faces puffy and red. My mother's eyes were glistening. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching a movie. I was sad, I supposed, but it was a logical sadness. She was old. Old people died. It was the natural order of things. I remember my mom reaching for my hand during the service. Her fingers were cold. "It's okay to be sad, you know," she whispered, squeezing my hand. "I'm all right, Mom," I said, giving her a reassuring smile that felt like it belonged to someone else. I was a pillar of strength. I was composed. Everyone said so. People came up to me afterward, patting my arm. "You're being so strong for your mother," they'd say. I accepted the praise, even though it felt like a lie. I wasn't being strong. I was being empty. The real test came about a year later. My mom called me on a Tuesday morning, and her voice was wrong. It was thin and shaky, a sound I hadn't heard since I was a little kid and she'd been scared by a spider. "Lily," she said, and then there was a long pause. "It's Dad. He had a fall. It's bad." My father, my cheerful, noisy, messy father who smelled like sawdust and coffee, had been on a ladder cleaning the gutters. A heart attack, they said later. Sudden and massive. He was gone before he hit the ground. I booked the first flight home. I went into autopilot. I called my boss. I packed a neat, sensible suitcase. I arranged for a neighbor to water my single, unkillable plant. It was a series of tasks, a checklist. It kept the door inside me firmly bolted. When I walked into my childhood home, the chaos hit me like a physical blow. The house was full of people, neighbors, my mom's friends, my aunts and uncles. There were platters of food on every surface, half-empty teacups, tissues balled up on end tables. It was noisy and messy and bursting with grief. It was everything I had run from. My mom saw me and her face crumpled. She threw her arms around me and she wasn't just crying, she was wailing. It was a raw, animal sound of pure agony. Her body shook with sobs against mine. And I just stood there, my arms awkwardly patting her back. "It'll be okay, Mom," I said. The words came out automatically, the same useless practical phrases I'd offered my friends in high school. "We need to start making a list of things to do. We need to call the funeral home. We need to sort out the paperwork." She pulled back and stared at me, her eyes red-rimmed and uncomprehending. "Paperwork?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Lily, your father is dead. My husband is dead." "I know," I said gently, trying to steer her toward a chair. "And we have to be practical." It was the wrong thing to say. It was a horrifically, catastrophically wrong thing to say. I saw a flash of hurt in her eyes so profound it almost knocked me over. It was worse than Liam's confusion. It was a look of utter betrayal. Practical? She pulled her arm away from me. I don't need you to be practical right now, Lily. I need my daughter. She turned away from me then, and let my aunt, who was openly weeping beside her, lead her into the kitchen. I stood alone in the hallway of my childhood home, surrounded by the loud, messy grief of people who knew how to feel. For the first time, my neat, logical world was not only useless, it was cruel. I had spent my entire life learning to be a girl people would like, a person who was composed and undramatic. But in the one moment it mattered most, my own mother couldn't even stand to look at me. The door inside me, the one I had so carefully built and reinforced, began to shudder on its hinges. A sound was building behind it, a scream that had been held back for 16 years, and I was terrified that this time it was going to break the whole house down. I didn't go to the kitchen. I couldn't face the looks of pity or the well-meaning hands on my arm. Instead, I turned and walked up the familiar, creaking stairs to my old bedroom. It was mostly the same, just softer and dustier. My mom had kept it as a sort of shrine to a daughter who didn't really exist anymore. The posters on the wall were of bands I'd pretended to like. The books on the shelf were ones I'd read for school, not for pleasure. I walked to the closet, my movements stiff and automatic. My heart was pounding, a loud, frantic drum against the inside of my ribs. I reached to the very back of the shelf behind a box of old photo albums, and my fingers brushed against it. The little jewelry box. It was still there. I pulled it out and sat on the edge of my childhood bed. My hands were shaking as I lifted the lid. There she was, the broken ballerina, a silent testament to the day the music died. She was a pathetic little thing, her smile grotesque in its permanence, her body forever fractured. And looking at her, the door didn't just shudder. It splintered. It blew off its hinges, and a tidal wave of everything I had locked away for 16 years came roaring out. A sound ripped out of my throat. A sound I didn't recognize as my own. It was a sob, but it was more than that. It was the grief for my father, the shame of hurting my mother, the loneliness of my entire adult life, the heartbreak over a boy with a lopsided grin, and the overwhelming, primal sorrow of an 8-year-old girl who was told her feelings were a mess. It was all there, in that one, ragged gasp. The tears that followed were hot and unstoppable. I wasn't crying quietly into a decorative pillow this time. I was wailing, my body hunched over the tiny plastic dancer as if I were mourning the whole world. I was dramatic. I was a spectacle. And I didn't care. The bedroom door creaked open. It was my mom. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with alarm. She saw me, heard the awful sounds I was making, and rushed to my side. "Lily, honey, what is it? What's wrong?" she asked, her voice frantic. I couldn't answer with words. I could only hold out my shaking hand. In my palm lay the jewelry box with the broken ballerina and her detached leg. My mom stared at it, her brow furrowed in confusion. The old music box. I remember this. Your grandmother's. And then, through the gut-wrenching sobs, the story finally came out. It wasn't neat or logical. It was a torrent of words tumbling over each other in their haste to be free. She said, "No one likes a dramatic girl." I choked out, the words tasting like poison. I broke it, and I was crying. And she said I was making a fuss. She said to throw it out. I hid it. I hid it because I was bad. I was messy. I closed the door. I closed the door so no one would see. I looked up at my mother, my vision blurred by the thick curtain of tears. I expected to see disappointment or maybe frustration, but I didn't. What I saw broke my heart all over again. I saw dawning, horrified understanding. Her own eyes filled with tears, not just for her husband, but for her daughter. For all the years she had sensed something was wrong, but didn't know how to reach me. For the little girl who was taught to equate sadness with shame. "Oh, Lily," she breathed, and her voice was filled with a pain that mirrored my own. "Oh, my sweet girl. No, no, no." She didn't offer platitudes or practical advice. She didn't tell me it would be okay. She just sat on the bed, pulled me into her arms, and held me. And for the first time in my memory, she cried with me. Our tears mingled, a messy, shared, heartbreaking symphony of grief for my father, and for the 16 years we had lost to a closed door. It was the hug I had been waiting for since I was 8 years old. It was permission. It was acceptance. It was home. We didn't fix everything in that moment, but we opened the door. In the days that followed, I cried a lot. I cried when I found my dad's favorite coffee mug in the dishwasher. I cried when I heard a song he used to love on the radio. I cried in the arms of my mother, and she cried with me. I wasn't a pillar of strength. I was a mess. And it was the most real, the most human I had ever felt. I was still a work in progress. But now, when I feel a storm brewing inside me, I don't run for shelter. I let the rain fall. I've learned that sadness isn't a performance and grief isn't a mess to be tidied away. It's just love, with nowhere to go. My grandmother was wrong. Life is dramatic. It is full of heartbreaking and beautiful and messy feelings. And people don't just like you in spite of them. They love you because of them.